In our history we had many bad years. Which one was the worst? Let's find out. What makes a bad year bad? There are three main ingredients: famine, war, and disease. Pretty much all years have a combination of those three, but some has just extra oomph. Now history is riddled with bad years. For example, First and Second World Wars, especially at the end of World War I, which is year 1918. The conflict was at its end, but then suddenly a Spanish flu replaced one calamity with another. Not only that, but it also killed more people than war itself. Up to 100 million people, which was 5% of our world population. Also, if you were Persian at the time, you were in the middle of Persian famine, which may have starved up to 10 million people. How ridiculously bad year was that, right? These victim numbers seem to be big, however, since the human population was quite large at the time, it didn't have such grave impact as, for example, year 1346. It all started in 1346, when the most fatal plague in the history started to spread through the Europe and North Africa. At that time, global human population was at around 350 million, and the Black Death almost killed half of our ancestors. Half! It is believed that due to climate change in Asia, rodents began to flee the dried out grasslands to more populated areas. These rats were infested with oriental rat fleas which transmitted bacteria Yersinia pestis, also known as bubonic plague. Interesting fact is that this bacterium forms some sort of a barrier inside flea gut, basically starving these little bastards. This blockage starves the fleas and drives them to aggressive feeding behavior, which is one of the main reasons why this disease spread so violently. Also, people back then didn't know the reason behind the disease. They thought that the bad air in the cities was the problem. Cherry on top, during the plague the almighty Mongols were invading Europe. But there is one year which is so bad that under no circumstances you should travel there with your time machine. It is year 536. However, it is not just one year, but the whole decade of just simple misery. In 536, a series of volcanic eruptions in various locations spilled an insurmountable amount of volcanic ash and sulfate aerosols into the atmosphere. When these materials reach the stratosphere, more sunlight is reflected or absorbed into the atmosphere. Summer temperatures fell as much as 2.5 degrees Celsius below normal. But it wasn't over. There were two more volcanic eruptions in year 540 and 547, which extended what is known as volcanic winter. But the most powerful effect was felt during years 536 to 537. It started when a mysterious fog swept over the continent, veiling the sun in a blue haze and casting Europe, the Middle East and parts of Asia into darkness 24 hours a day for 18 months. The darkness cast was not pitch black though. The sun simply shined through a fog. Some accounts stated this: "We marvel to see no shadows or bodies at noon. Imagine seeing no shadows during a cloudless day." Anyway, lack of sunlight created the coldest decade. There were frosts and snows in the middle of the summer. China even reported summer snow. Most of Europe experienced frost and frozen soil, killing their crops or stopping them from growing. In 538, a Roman statesman described this in his letter. The heat from the sun was feeble. The moon, even full, was empty of splendor. A winter without storms, a spring without mildness, and a summer without heat. Prolonged frost and unseasonable drought. The seasons seemed to be all jumbled up together. Frosts during the harvest, which made apples harden and grapes sour. They needed to use stored food to last through the situation. So basically, there was a global famine. What food reserves there were didn't last long. People started to migrate in search of better life, so the whole empires were crumbling. Even when the skies cleared of ash, people struggled to get a good yield on their crops. Record keeping across Europe shows failed harvests and mounting bodies across kingdoms, and not eating enough gave way to bad immune system. Remember the Black Death that happened in 13th century? Well, the second worst plague happened right after the global famine in 537. It is known as Plague of Justinian. In 541, the Plague of Justinian swept across the Eurasian continent. It was the same bacterium as the Black Death, bubonic plague, and was named after Byzantine emperor of the time, who also caught it at one point. It is estimated that up to 50 million people have died, which is basically half of the population. As a result of the plague in the countryside, farmers could not take care of the crops and the price of grain rose. Don't forget that grain still had trouble growing since the colder temperatures still prevailed after 536, especially since volcanoes kept at it in years 540 and 547. So they had famine and disease. Did they have third ingredient, war? Sure they did. For example, there was a Gothic War that lasted for 19 years. But not only Europe was suffering during that time. For some reason, in Peru people experienced 30 years of heavy rainfall followed by 30 years of drought. In India, floods also ravaged the Gupta Empire, bringing it to the end after 200 years. By saying worst year, it also depends on the location. For example, at the time, the Arabian world saw the fertility in their soil increase. This could be due to global temperature decrease, which was quite beneficial for hotter regions. Also, there were way worse years for other regions of the world. For example, the worst year for natives is probably 1520, when smallpox brought over by Spanish killed millions of indigenous people. By 1600, up to 90% of the population of the Americas was wiped out by various European pathogens. But was there even worse year than 536, which ruined lives for decades? Quite possibly. We don't know the exact year, but it started around 2200 BC and lasted for a whole century. It is called 4.2 kiloyear event. Apparently every 1000 years there's a big shift in climatic patterns in the northern hemisphere, and this had caused widespread droughts, bringing down major empires. So 2200 BC was the time when those horrible droughts pretty much destroyed the old kingdom of Egypt, Akkadian Empire of Mesopotamia, Lanzhou culture in the lower Yangtze River area, Indus Valley civilization, and many others. However, some scientists disagree with 4.2 kiloyear event. They say that there is evidence that the event was not a global drought and did not happen in a clear timeline. It may have been a coincidence that so many empires were ruined at such a small time frame.